It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Vikas. He was actually one of the first speakers to join the lineup, and I think that really speaks to his philosophy of saying yes and encouraging girls around the world, and specifically in India, to pursue their education. So I'm excited to hear from him. Thank you, Vikas.
Hi, thank you so much, Jana, and I wish you a very, very happy birthday.
Thank you.
So Jana asked me to join this this celebration, and it's a great idea to have 17 speakers on girls' education on her 17th birthday, which she tells me has already passed, but nonetheless, we still expect some birthday cake from you, Jana. So when we talk about education, we will see, as we are experiencing at the moment, huge disruption to the way that we function, not just in education, but in society as a whole. I live in London, in the UK, and what we have is the lockdown would simply not work if schools were still running. And so the question now comes after many months of observing quarantine, when should schools reopen? And it's a really tough question because if kids stay at home, parents have to stay at home. The structural shape of society is geared such that we go to work 9 to 5. Most people do. And for that reason, schools are also of a particular time span. Now, if that was all to change, if society was to say that actually we want everything to change, it's quite difficult to do it rapidly and for the outcome that everyone wants. So when everyone talks about, maybe there's a silver lining to the COVID crisis, yes, there may be. But, education has been such a thing that, ever since the first industrial revolution, the basic premise hasn't changed, which is we still sit in classrooms, still sit at the front, look at the front, there's a teacher at the front, and we still use textbooks. And these kind of things. So, the way that we've been delivering education has been quite resilient to change. And you have to ask the question, why? A few years ago, the United Nations set something called the Sustainable Development Goals. And these succeeded the Millennium Development Goals, which was for the first time, the world decided that there were some goals that they were all going to try and achieve. The Sustainable Development Goals, which are the SDGs, there's 17 of them, and goal number 4 is to do with education. Now, we're already in 2020, and we should have achieved by 2030 these goals, and everyone put their hands up. Even before this crisis, we were challenged in terms of the achievement of these goals, and there's some very stark facts that we have to contend with. The first is, when you look at education the world over, what we mean is primary and secondary schooling. And for that, in a brick and mortar sense, in the traditional sense of education, requires teachers. And, I ask this question quite often in terms of if we wanted to achieve this goal, a simple thing that we have to do, when I say simple, it's a simple way of thinking of it, at least, it's a very hard thing to do, which is we need to recruit more teachers. And so I ask the question normally in terms of, well, what do you think that number is? Just to gauge someone's understanding as to the scale of the challenge. And more often than not, the people that I ask, who are usually pretty educated themselves and pretty plugged into the SDG agenda, get it really wrong. So I ask a question, I give some multiple choice. I say, is it 1,000 new teachers by 2030? Is it 1 million new teachers? Is it 10 million new teachers? Or is it 20 million new teachers? Now, when I say it like that, most people will hover around 1 and 10 million. But the answer actually is 69 million new teachers we're required to deliver the SDG agenda. So that's one of the challenges that we have with the SDGs. Most countries have a teacher recruitment and retention crisis that we perhaps don't realize, but it exists. Just in my country, in the UK, after 5 years of a teacher being recruited to become a teacher, fresh from university, over 50% of those teachers leave the profession. So within 5 years, they leave the profession, and that's quite a number. It's quite a proportion. And so we really need to think about how we recruit and retain teachers. The second part of it is to do with, because today we're focusing on girls, there's also a statistic that says that it's the year, if I'm not mistaken, 2083, before every single girl in the world gets the opportunity to go to school. 2083. If it's not 2083, it's probably a year or so around there. But the point I make is progress couldn't come fast enough. Are we willing to wait till 2083 for this to become a reality? The answer surely has to be no. And we have to think in terms of, well, how is it that we address this challenge? Now, on top of that, we have the added challenge of what's happened to us in the last 2-3 months. And that itself is a huge shock to the system. And, you know, it's already a challenge in places like India, in many places like in Africa, to enroll girls into schools. Now, can you imagine, with all this economic strife, families are financially challenged. And in those contexts, you know, you're more often than not going to ask your daughter to stay at home, to contribute towards the wage of the house by going to work, or in many cases, you know, are trafficked, and so many ills happen as a result of such movements. And so we as a society have to think in terms of how we respond to this. And that really is a big part of what people need to think about. Now, what we've seen during the COVID crisis with the closure of schools around the world, you know, for the first time, we have a commonality of experience, no matter if you're in Nigeria or whether you're in Norway. You know, schools are shut, and it's come at such a pace, and it's surprised everyone as to what's happened. The preparedness of our systems hasn't really been there. And so, you know, what has been happening in those 2 or 3 months? Well, the first thing is, I think there is an appreciation for what teachers do finally, because of homeschooling. A lot of parents I hear say, well, now we understand it, and teachers actually should be paid $1 million a year for the incredible job that they do. Well, before this, the perception was teachers are just there. Yeah, in many respects, in many cases, we didn't really understand what they do. But now, because we've been responsible for the education of our children at home, we now understand, you know, it's no different to being a doctor or an engineer. There's a process teachers go through for a reason, to train and develop themselves. And that's what I think is the most critical thing for us to understand as a result of the COVID crisis, a huge appreciation for teachers. Now, when we look at the other aspects of the corona crisis, what we have with the school closures is are issues to do with equity. Now, obviously, I live in a G7 country, a very Western industrialized country. And even over here, you wouldn't say that children are are necessarily privileged. By that I mean that the number of children who are classified as vulnerable are no way the minority that we think that they are. There's a vast number of vulnerable children in our education system who, because they're not at school, are at greater risk. Whether it's through just hardship and economic times, their families have a challenge in that regard. So they depend upon free school meals, or whether you have you're a child, or you are a family with a child who has additional or special needs. The school is often the place that becomes the hub of your life. And if that school's not functioning, or you have such a situation, equity becomes a problem. There's already a lot of concern about all these weeks that children have been off, even if they have been homeschooling. There's a question about the learning loss that's happened. There's some interest in thinking through, well, how do we make up for this learning loss? And so issues of equity actually are pretty pronounced, and they're not just a sideshow. They're actually a real thing that is happening. And of course, because Jana, you're in the US, this is the land of opportunity and the American dream, and technology is at your fingertips everywhere you look. The question you really have around technology is actually we make an assumption that everyone has a computer, has a laptop, has an iPad, or whatever device it is, even in these kind of countries. But I can tell you from I sit on the advisory board of Educate Girls, which is one of the most preeminent girls charities in the world. That the challenges that you have in many parts of the world are, the family has one mobile phone, and in such times, there's no chance that the girl is actually going to have it. The parents are not going to entrust the girl with it. If anyone gets it, it's the boy to continue his education. So we have a lot of issues that we have to deal with in regards to, also hardware technology, software. But what's really interesting around the world are the experiments and the trials that are happening, for example, in Brazil, where they are broadcasting on TV, on the national TV channels, grade-wise and subject-wise lessons during the day. So that because everyone has a TV set, or in places like Sierra Leone and in places in India, they're using radio as the medium to reach students, because a radio set is more or less universal in most places. And so these are some of the things that are happening to try to continue, providing education to children all over the world. It's not as straightforward as using Microsoft Teams for everyone, or Google Classroom, or anything like that. We have to be real in that the vast majority of children, reside in Africa and South Asia, and for that reason, we have to think about solutions that actually work for them as well. And in all of this, I will say to you that it is, in fact, girls that are probably impacted the most, no matter where they are in the world. And we, as adults and as leaders, need to think about that very carefully and work solutions that actually benefit marginalized constituencies, of which I would say girls are definitely at the top. So my engagement on the subject of girls' education comes from many years, apart from being a parent to two girls, comes from recently, as I said, I joined the board of the advisory board of Educate Girls. And the one thing its founder, Safina Hussein, talks about is how one of the quickest and surest ways of tackling climate change is making sure every girl is educated. And so when I think about it in the context of societal development and the SDG agenda, I think girls' education ranks at if not at the top, then certainly near the top. And that's why I applaud you, Jana, for your activism and your campaigning for girls' education. If only at 17 I'd had your wisdom and your energy and your activism and direction, that I think that we could have started much earlier on this journey of promoting education. I'll stop there, but if you have any questions, Jana, please do ask.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vikas. I would actually love to hear about how you think is the best way to amplify the voices of young youth who are kind of advocating for girls' education worldwide right now.
So what? Again, I hate to name drop, please. I say that with all humility, but because of what my role and what I used to do, I have the opportunity of meeting some very influential people. Mm-hmm. Last year, for example, I had the privilege of meeting with President Obama, and he was giving a speech, and I was in the audience. And he said something quite interesting. So, education is something that is largely driven by government. It's a public sector good in many parts of the world. So 99% of all education is down to what the government does. And so, as someone who believes in the levers that policy give to making sure that, equitable development happens, as someone who believed in politics, someone who believes in policy making, he said something quite startling. And he said, look, he was asked the question in terms of what is the one lesson you've learned through your 8 years of being the most powerful person in the world and occupying the Oval Office. And he said something startling. He explained that, at one time he used to think that policy moved the needle on a lot of things, but he doesn't believe so anymore. And his comment was, it's actually stories and storytellers that move the needle now. And that actually resonated with me and made me understand a lot better in terms of what people can do. The one thing that I would say to you, where you excel and where the vast majority of the people that I deal with don't, is in storytelling. I mean, you created this platform, you've created the opportunity, you're bringing people together, and you're helping to connect the dots. And I think that's a really important thing that you're doing. But more than anything else, if I was to ask people in terms of, well, I don't think it's an either or, but being in politics is not necessarily the only thing you can do to serve society. I think there's a huge role for people like you who are so effective at mobilizing emotion in people that gets them energized and supportive of different things. And so that is the primacy and the role of storytelling in development, and especially in girls' education. We need more activists like you to embrace that as opposed to anything else.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think one of the other things that I've heard throughout the day has been about the importance of sharing stories that are outside of the mainstream story narrative, right? And so I mean, oftentimes we hear about just one narrative, and I think that can often box in some of the youth that will change the world in the future. And so I would love to hear your perspective on how teachers and youth can work together to advance issues like girls' education, but also beyond girls' education. Because if you care about climate change, or if you care about gun violence, I think it's really important that your voice and your story is being told, because those are the stories that matter the most.
Yeah, I mean, so there's plenty of examples, but it comes down to your activism and your awareness that actually all these different platforms exist. Now, I admit not everyone is comfortable communicating, verbally at least, but at least you can show and tell. You can do many things to make sure that you put a story out there. Now, what's really interesting, again, is if you look at how different sectors have approached mass change on their own. And if I leave the education sector behind, if I look at what the climate lobby has done over the last 10, 15 years, is nothing but impressive. And the way they've done that actually is they have, in my opinion at least, not had one champion or one story, but it's the philosophy of let 1,000 flowers bloom, and various and multitude of efforts, of which there's an admission that some will fail and some will succeed. But in the end, everyone will rise as a result of it. And in girls' education, I think that's what's also required. That I think you have powerful actors like Safina, like Lucy Lake, like Susanna from the Malala Fund, and all the other people that you have over here. I just wish that they would start combining and joining hands together more effectively, and direct their resources in a way that you can mobilize en masse people. Because if we miss this 2030 deadline, which we are headed towards missing, I think it's a travesty. I mean, why should we wait till whatever it is, 2083, before every girl gets to school? I think that's a massive injustice, and we as leaders need to step up our efforts.
Yeah, and I would actually love to hear about so I know you have two young girls, and they actually just said hi, and they're 14 and 16, so pretty close to age to myself. But I'd love to hear about how you encourage them just within your household to advocate for SDG 5 and help the world reach the 2030 goals.
Well, one of my daughters is sat opposite me, so I'll be very careful what I say.
Hi.
And what happens, Jana, is that the one thing I do agree is in terms of parenting, and your mother has clearly done this with you, and I take and I doff my hat to her, is actually rather than clip wings, you actually make them fly, and so that's the approach that I'd like to think we've taken, my wife and I think it's really important to do that.
Thank you. Yeah. And then finally, I think we have a couple of more minutes. So I would just love to hear a little bit about how kind of your own personal story has shaped your values of education and helped you connect with teachers and students globally.
Yeah, I mean, so, my grandparents left India in the early 1900s, and they went to East Africa. where my father and his generation was born. My generation was also born in East Africa, and because of political instability, we were fortunate to be able to move to the UK. And so, in terms of in my own journey, I remember my mother, who, when she got married, she was barely literate, didn't speak any English, and apart from the language of Hindi.
Wow.
And we landed up in a place like London, and you have to deal with it. And I remember she saying to me, and it's a really powerful moment. I remember she saying, "Look, I can't give you guidance on your own education. All I can see is that whoever gets to university does really well. So make sure you get to university." And that's how she left it. And I was challenged in terms of my own education. I didn't get the best grades. I didn't go to the best schools. But that stayed with me, and that belief that education gets you over the line, I think, is very powerful. In terms of the whole teacher story, for the last decade, I used to run a family foundation based in out of Dubai, and we had a big campaign around teachers. And the reason why I chose teachers as the campaign platform is because no one really cares about teachers in the education system. When you think about interventions or giving to charity, you give to girls' charities, you give to, school building programs, scholarship programs, you give to universities, you give to WASH programs, but no one thinks of, no education system can outperform the quality of its teachers. And with that belief, if you understand that, then you would put all your chips behind teachers, as opposed to anywhere else. It's in education, it is as close to the, I don't want to call it the silver bullet, but the silver bullet when it comes to making sure that we exceed learning outcomes year on year.
Yeah, so I talked about this a little bit earlier with my conversation in the Malala Fund, but I think now, given everything that's currently happening, right, I think parents and students are beginning to value teachers as much as they should have been valued long ago, right? And so I know in our own household, I have a little brother, he's 10 or 11, and I'm having to say, okay, Adam, I think that's enough video games for the day. Let's get on to do some math. And I think that's something that's super underappreciated about teachers globally, is their role in not only advocating for their students, but also encouraging their students to follow through with their passions. Because I think a teacher plays such a huge role in shaping those passions, and in my own life have shaped kind of my advocacy and my activist work so much. And I don't think I could have done it without any of them. And so
who is your favorite teacher? And why?
That's a tough question. And I know some teachers are listening in too, so I don't think I can answer that. But I think I'm trying to think when I was younger, who my favorite teacher was. And I'm thinking of this one teacher in second grade who was super strict. I think her name was Miss Lawrence. And she very often would she just had a very set schedule, and she had very set expectations in the classroom. And yet one of the things I think about is that she made every single student feel valued and heard. And so she was strict because she wanted to make sure every student got the chance to speak, and that no little 6-year-old boy would speak over them or shout over them. And I think that has kind of stuck with me since then, actually. And so, I think we are both so grateful for all that teachers do. And I think that's a great segue, actually, to our next session with Drew, who I see has shown up, which is great. So thank you so much, Vikas, for that wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed speaking with you. And hope to.
And Jana, once again, a very happy birthday to you.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Take care. Bye-bye.